Hey gang, can anyone of you remember your high school physics classes? Anyone remember learning Newton's laws of motion? The third law of motion in particular, it's that law about action and reaction. Let me refresh your memory. The law of Newton says that every action has an equal and opposite, say it with me, reaction. Now you remember it. Newton suggested that when I exert force on an object, that object exerts an equal and opposite force on the object I'm exerting force with. Why the physics lesson today? Because believe it or not, in the 9th chapter of Romans, Paul is giving us a physics lesson, a religious physics lesson. You want to catch this. In the first 29 verses of Romans chapter 9, Paul is giving us his version of Newton's third law of motion. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. What do I mean? Well, bear with me here for a minute. If you read the beginning of chapter 9, you can't help but notice that Paul is sad. He's sad for the reaction some of his people, God's people, the Israelites, the Jewish people of that day, that they have had to the story of Jesus. Paul points out that his people, the Israelites, were the ones first adopted by God, first given God's glory, first given the covenants, the law, the temple worship, and all God's promises. God first gave them the patriarchs, and it was from them that the human ancestry of Jesus actually came. And yet Paul laments. He's in anguish. He's deeply disappointed because of the reaction his people have had. He's deeply troubled by their reaction to God's choice to now fling wide open the doors of God's family, to tear down the walls that kept some as outsiders to faith. He laments Israel's reaction to the action God has taken, now extending God's invitation to the Gentiles, people who were formerly seen as outsiders to God's love. Paul's heartbroken because some of his own people have rejected the mission of Jesus, even rejecting Jesus himself. But honestly, for Paul, it's not a surprise, because for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Remember Newton's law of motion? Paul applies it to Jesus. Jesus took action. He included the Gentiles, these outsiders, and surprise, surprise, there was an equal and opposite reaction on the part of some of the Israelites. They rejected Paul's mission to the Gentiles and the claim that Jesus himself was the Messiah. There was action, there was reaction. There's cause and effect. A push causes a stumble. There's action and reaction. In a sense, he knows that both of these, there are two sides of the same coin. And so he goes back recalling this action-reaction motif, cause and effect, how it's happened again and again in God's story. For Isaac to be the heir to the promise, Ishmael can't be. For Jacob to carry the line, Esau must be overcome. For Israel to be set free, Pharaoh must be hardened. For the world to be saved, God must not spare his own son. There is God's action and a reaction, cause and effect. They're two sides of the same coin. And now, God's acting again. He's including the Gentiles. And sadly, there's a reaction. God's people, Israel, are rejecting them. And here's what Paul seems to understand. For God, it's worth it. It's worth the reaction. As hard as it is for Paul, it's worth it. God knows there's going to be a reaction, but it's all worth it because it sure beats the alternative. It beats God staying closed. It beats God's mercy being hoarded by a small Middle Eastern faction. It beats God's reign staying small and insignificant. It beats God's kingdom staying self-righteous and exclusive and untouchable for some. God's action is worth the reaction. Paul suggests it's worth it to God so that all the world would know, so that people like you and me would know the incomprehensible love of Jesus. A couple of questions. Why do you think people sometimes have negative reactions to the idea that God's love is for all? And secondly, what action have you taken in your life that has caused a reaction in the lives of people you care about? Was it worth it? Thanks for tuning in today.